Section 6 of History of Egypt, Volume 1, by Gaston Maspero. Into the Public Domain. Chapter 1. The Nile and Egypt, Part 6. We had, therefore, good grounds for supposing that the first Egyptians were semi-savages, like those still living in Africa and America, having an analogous organization, and similar weapons and tools. A few lived in the desert, in the oasis of Libya, or in the deep valleys of the Red Land, Doshirit, to Doshiru, between the Nile and the sea, the poverty of the country fostering their native savagery. Others, settled on the Black Land, gradually became civilized, and we have found of late considerable remains of those of their generations who, if not anterior to the times of written records, were at least contemporary with the earliest kings of the first historical dynasty. Their houses were like those of the fellahs of to-day, low huts of wattle daubed with puddled clay, or of bricks dried in the sun. They contained one room, either oblong or square, the door being the only aperture. Those of the richer class only were large enough to make it needful to support the roof by means of one or more trunks of trees, which did duty for columns. Earthen pots, turned by hand, flint knives and other implements, mats of reeds or plaited straw, 2 flat stones for grinding corn, a few pieces of wooden furniture, stools, and head rests for use at night, comprised all the contents. Their ordinary pottery is heavy and almost devoid of ornament, but some of the finer kinds have been moulded and baked in wicker-work baskets, which have left a quaint, trellis-like impression on the surface of the clay. In many cases the vases are bicolour, the body being of a fine smooth red, polished with a stone, while the neck and base are of an intense black, the surface of which is even more shining than that of the red part. Sometimes they are ornamented with patterns in white, of flowers, palms, ostriches, gazelles, boats with undulated or broken lines, or geometrical figures of a very simple nature. More often the ground is coloured a fine yellow, and the decoration has been traced in red lines. Jars, saucers, double vases, flat plates, large cups, supports for amphorae, trays raised on a foot, in short, every kind of form is found in use at that remote period. The men went about nearly naked, except the nobles, who wore panther skin, sometimes thrown over the shoulders, sometimes drawn round the waist, and covering the lower part of the body, the animal's tail touching the heels behind, as we see later in several representations of the negroes of the Upper Nile. They smeared their limbs with grease or oil, and they tattooed their faces and bodies, at least in part, but in later times this practice was retained by the lower classes only. On the other hand, the custom of painting the face was never given up. To complete their toilette, it was necessary to accentuate the arch of the eyebrow with a line of kohl, antimony powder. A similar black line surrounded and prolonged the oval of the eye to the middle of the temple, a layer of green coloured the underlid, and ochre and carmine enlivened the tints of the cheeks and lips. The hair, plaited, curled, oiled, and plastered with grease, formed an erection which was as complicated in the case of the man as in that of the women. Should the hair be too short, a black or blue wig, dressed with much skill, was substituted for it. Ostrich feathers waved on the heads of warriors, and a large lock, flattened behind the right ear, distinguished the military or religious chiefs from their subordinates. When the art of weaving became common, a belt and loincloth of white linen replaced the leathern garment. Fastened round the waist, but so low as to leave the navel uncovered, the loincloth frequently reached to the knee, the hinder part was frequently drawn between the legs and attached in front to the belt, thus forming a kind of drawers. Tails of animals and wild beasts' skin were henceforth only the insignia of authority with which priests and princes adorned themselves on great days and at religious ceremonies. The skin was sometimes carelessly thrown over the left shoulder and swayed with the movement of the body; sometimes it was carefully adjusted over one shoulder and under the other, so as to bring the curve of the chest into prominence. The head of the animal, skilfully prepared and enlivened by large eyes of enamel, rested on the shoulder or fell just below the waist of the wearer; the paws, with the claws attached, hung down over the thighs; the spots of the skin were manipulated so as to form 5 pointed stars. On going out of doors, a large wrap was thrown over all; this covering was either smooth or hairy, similar to that in which the Nubians and Abyssinians of the present day envelop themselves. It could be draped in various ways, transversely over the left shoulder like the fringed shawl of the Chaldeans, or hanging straight from both shoulders like a mantle. In fact it did duty as a cloak, sheltering the wearer from the sun or from the rain, from the heat or from the cold. They never sought to transform it into a luxurious garment of state, as was the case in later times with the Roman toga, whose amplitude secured a certain dignity of carriage, and whose folds, carefully adjusted beforehand, fell around the body with studied grace. The Egyptian mantle, when not required, was thrown aside and folded up. The material being fine and soft, it occupied but a small space, and was reduced to a long thin roll; the ends being then fastened together, it was slung over the shoulder and round the body like a cavalry cloak. Travellers, shepherds, and all those whose occupations called them to the fields, carried it as a bundle at the ends of their sticks. Once arrived at the scene of their work, they deposited it in a corner with their provisions until they required it. The women were at first contented with a loin cloth like that of the men; it was enlarged and lengthened till it reached the ankle below and the bosom above, and became a tightly fitting garment, with 2 bands over the shoulders like braces to keep it in place. The feet were not always covered; on certain occasions, however, sandals of coarse leather, plaited straw, split reed, or even painted wood adorned those shapely Egyptian feet, which, to suit our taste, should be a little shorter. Both men and women loved ornaments, and covered their necks, breasts, arms, wrists, and ankles with many rows of necklaces and bracelets. The bracelets were made of elephant ivory, mother of pearl, or even flint, very cleverly perforated. The necklaces were composed of strings of pierced shells, interspersed with seeds and little pebbles, either sparkling or of unusual shapes. Subsequently imitations in terra cotta replaced the natural shells, and precious stones were substituted for pebbles, as were also beads of enamel, either round, pear-shaped, or cylindrical. The necklaces were terminated and a uniform distance maintained between the rows of beads, by several slips of wood, bone, ivory, porcelain, or terra cotta, pierced with holes, through which ran the threads. Weapons, at least among the nobility, were an indispensable part of costume. Most of them were for hand-to-hand fighting: sticks, clubs, lances, furnished with a sharpened bone or stone point, axes and daggers of flint, sabres and clubs of bone or wood variously shaped, pointed or rounded at the end, with blunt or sharp blades, inoffensive enough to look at, but wielded by a vigorous hand, sufficient to break an arm, crush in the ribs, or smash a skull with all desirable precision. The plain or triple curved bow was the favourite weapon for attack at a distance, but in addition to this there were the sling, the javelin, and a missile almost forgotten nowadays, the boomerang. We have no proof, however, that the Egyptians handled the boomerang with the skill of the Australians, or that they knew how to throw it so as to bring it back to its point of departure. Such was approximately the most ancient equipment as far as we can ascertain, but at a very early date copper and iron were known in Egypt. Long before historic times, the majority of the weapons in wood were replaced by those of metal: daggers, sabres, hatchets, which preserved, however, the shape of the old wooden instruments. Those wooden weapons which were retained, were used for hunting, or were only brought out on solemn occasions when tradition had to be respected. The war baton became the commander's wand of authority, and at last degenerated into the walking stick of the rich or noble. The club at length represented merely the rank of a chieftain, while the crook and the wooden-handled mace, with its head of ivory, diorite, granite, or white stone, the favourite weapons of princes, continued to the last the most revered insignia of royalty. Life was passed in comparative ease and pleasure. Of the ponds left in the open country by the river at its fall, some dried up more or less quickly during the winter, leaving on the soil an immense quantity of fish, the possession of which birds and wild beasts disputed with man. Other pools, however, remained till the returning inundation, as so many vivaria in which the fish were preserved for dwellers on the banks. Fishing with the harpoon, made either of stone or of metal, with the line, with a net, or with traps, were all methods of fishing known and used by the Egyptians from early times. Where the ponds failed, the neighbouring Nile furnished them with inexhaustible supplies. Standing in light canoes, or rather supported by a plank on bundles of reeds bound together, they ventured into midstream, in spite of the danger arising from the ever present hippopotamus, or they penetrated up the canals amid a thicket of aquatic plants, to bring down with the boomerang the birds which found covert there. The fowl and fish which could not be eaten fresh, were dried, salted, or smoked, and kept for a rainy day. Like the river, the desert had its perils and its resources. Only too frequently, the lion, the leopard, the panther, and other large felidza were met with there. Section 6. Professor Heather and For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.